Damaged Defenders by Scherza. Chapter 116, Magneto. Contrary to popular opinion, Magneto was not insane, nor was he megalomaniacal, nor was he psychopathic or sociopathic. Not in his own opinion, and despite Charles' mutation and what Charles liked to think, Magneto did in fact know himself and his own mind better than Charles did. What he was terrified, enraged beyond reason, and desperate. Not that in the final analysis, that was truly a good thing. Magneto was self-aware enough to admit that. Desperation, rage, and terror could and frequently did drive men to do things they would otherwise never countenance individually. All three together. Well, it simply meant he had made his choices without the benefit of being able to claim being not sane to one degree or another. Though it must be said that he had every reason in the world to be terrified, enraged, and desperate. He had lived exactly how far people with more power than sense were willing to go to eradicate a group of people they didn't like. He'd seen some 6 million of his own people slaughtered, most of them in ways that were utterly horrifying to contemplate, never mind witness. He'd seen his own parents slaughtered in such a way. Not that he had witnessed every death, of course, but he'd seen far too many during his incarceration, where far too many meant one. The only reason he'd escaped that fate himself was thanks to his powers. They simply hadn't been equipped to detain someone who could control metal. Granted, back then, control had been something of an exaggeration, but still, he'd gotten out thanks to his powers, and had gotten quite a few of his fellow inmates out as well. And he'd vowed one simple thing: never again. In those early days, it had been a personal vow. He'd been unaware there were others like him. It had driven him to live on the edges of civilization for a time, terrified that someone would realize he was not normal, and attempt to detain him again. That they might even be clever enough to keep metal away from him when they did such a thing. Then he'd met Charles, and that singular status had changed. And with the knowledge there were others like him, well, never again had very quickly become a blanket statement. He would do whatever it took, pay any price required of him to prevent another Holocaust. Even now, in this pristine metal-free prison, he woke from room-shaking nightmares of mutants in shackles in concentration camps, marks on their clothes and skin, and dying or being experimented on in various horrific ways. Charles could never understand Magneto's stance. Charles had lived a completely normal life. He'd never been hated and hunted, and while his mutation had caused him no small amount of grief, no one had ever figured out that he was different. As a result of that, Charles sincerely believed that mutants keeping their heads down and blending in would keep things from blowing up in everyone's faces. Ridiculous. Jews, and more than one other hated group, had tried that. They'd still been hunted, driven from their homes almost everywhere they'd gone to escape persecution. And they'd had the benefit of looking like everyone else. Some mutants didn't have that luxury. They had no hope of going unnoticed. He and Charles had parted ways years ago over their ideological differences. And Magneto had begun to plan. He had overall no real quarrel with the average citizen. Oh, they could be bigots and prejudiced, but the damage any one average Joe could do was minimal. Even the hate groups were only a minimal threat because they were largely despised, marginalized, and hunted when they pulled their various illegal stunts, which greatly lessened their ability to do harm. The religious zealots were a bit more dangerous than the hate groups, mostly due to their belief they were doing their God's will, but they could still be handled. It was the world leaders, policymakers, law enforcers, and militaries that were the problem. The ones, in short, with the power to make and enforce laws like those Hitler had enacted that have resulted in the Holocaust. They were the real threat, one that had to be neutralized. Somehow. This was where Magneto's lack of true insanity came in, because for all he wanted to stop another Holocaust, he was not yet on board with killing at all, never mind indiscriminately. Hence the machine. No one would die, they would just become mutants, and thus have a vested interest in mutants being treated well. Had it worked, there would not have been even collateral damage, not in the truest sense of the word. Some few average citizens would have become mutants, yes, but no one would have died. And it truly would have been a small number of average citizens. The machine's area of effect would not have gone more than a mile past where the UN meeting was taking place. That was why he'd placed the machine on Liberty Island. He could have easily hidden it somewhere in the city proper and changed half the city or more, if that had been his goal. He still wasn't entirely sure the machine wouldn't have worked. He had only the X-Men's word it hadn't. Only a fool took an enemy combatant at his word in the middle of a conflict. People would say and do anything to get hostilities to cease. Now, several months after the fact, he was of a mind to believe their claim that it had killed Senator Kelly, if for no other reason than the fact that someone trained by Charles would not entertain the notion of lying to the enemy. Whether or not it would kill everyone, that Magneto was not so sure about. Regardless, the machine was no longer viable for use. Rebuilding it would be easy, but even if he could find a way to power it without killing himself into the bargain, he was still not on board with killing anyone if it could be avoided. It was too bad that he and Wolverine had met under the circumstances they had. Wolverine had won Magneto's reluctant respect for his refusal to stop, even in the face of Magneto being able to control his body. Granted, Magneto also thought him somewhat stupid for not stopping, but he could understand and respect the impetus that had driven Wolverine. He could also respect someone who refused to stop until their goal had been met, whatever that goal might be, and was pragmatic enough to use whatever methods were required to attain that goal. That the man was also bitter and jaded and very familiar himself with what people were willing to do to those they hated. Well, under better circumstances, Magneto might just have been able to recruit Wolverine to his cause. But there was absolutely no chance of that now, having worked with Sabretooth, who had a fairly similar mutation for years. Magneto knew that Wolverine would never be persuaded that Magneto was anything but an enemy to be killed at the first opportunity to do so. The only other proof that anyone needed as to how far Magneto had not gone over the edge was the fact that he was still in prison. Magneto's power had started small, for a given value of that word. He'd only been able to manipulate ferrous metals in his line of sight for over a decade after he'd manifested. But gradually, as he had gotten older, his power had expanded and refined. First to ferrous metals not in his line of sight, but within a few hundred meters of himself. The distance he could reach ferrous metals had then slowly expanded to roughly 2 miles. In all directions. Then eventually, he'd started to begin to manipulate non-ferrous metals. Again, at first, it had been metals in line of sight, slowly expanding to not in line of sight, and again out to about 2 miles. Not that he had ever let anyone see just how much he could do, how far he could reach. Not even Charles had known. Magneto had mostly stuck to manipulating ferrous metal in his line of sight when he used his powers around people, and allowed them to make their own assumptions based on those performances. Charles had seen a bit more. He'd been there when Magneto had started to be able to manipulate non-ferrous metals. But Charles, like everyone else, was under the delusion that Magneto needed to be able to see what he was manipulating. The point being, they designed his prison with that line of sight rule in mind. There was absolutely no metal anywhere within that range. But there was metal within his reach. Metal he was not using in an effort to escape, because doing so would result in civilian casualties. Rather, a lot of civilian casualties. Casualties he was not yet fine with causing. So he stayed, bided his time, considered his options, entertained the regular visits from Charles, and let Charles try to talk some sense into him. Charles had made it clear very early on that he was watching the facility like a hawk. Not in an attempt to keep Magneto from escaping, though Magneto wasn't fool enough to think that wasn't also on Charles' agenda, but to make sure no one with nefarious intentions got anywhere near Magneto without assurance. Well, this was almost a vacation of sorts. There would come a time when he'd need to leave, of that Magneto had no doubt. But until the day came that civilian casualties no longer mattered, for whatever reason, he would remain. Magneto was broken from his quiet contemplation by the sound of the machinery that extended and retracted the walkway, kicking into gear. He blinked and looked towards the door. It was not yet a mealtime, nor was it a day when Charles would visit him. What on earth? Or better, who? Thanks to the see-through design of his cell and the walkway, he got a pretty good look at the pair being escorted towards his cell by one of the guards. They were both tall, one slightly taller than the other. The taller of the two was dark-haired, pale, and built on very long and lean lines. The marginally shorter of the two was more solidly built and vaguely familiar. It took Magneto nearly the entire time the two were traversing the walkway to place where he'd seen the second man before, mostly because he'd never seen the man out of uniform. But even out of uniform, the so-called Captain America was distinctive. This had Charles written all over it. Magneto had absolutely no idea how Captain America had come to be in the here and now. Last he had heard, the man had still been buried under who knew how much ice and water somewhere in the northern half of the Atlantic Ocean, or maybe even within the Arctic Circle. Innumerable unsuccessful searches to locate him and the plane he'd gone down in had been conducted over the decades. Magneto would absolutely not put it past Charles to have found the man. Magneto had a far better idea of how powerful Charles was than Charles did of him. It was not outside the realm of possibility that Charles had, via Cerebro, found and obviously still alive, though how that could be, Magneto hadn't the foggiest idea, Captain America, and sent his students to dig the man out. And of course, Charles would ask the man to talk to Magneto, given, well, everything. Charles would hope that Magneto would heed the man's words. Magneto was honest enough with himself to admit Charles was even right. Inasmuch as Captain America was revered by much of the world in general, he was even more revered and respected in the Jewish community. While his focus had not been on destroying the concentration camps or even on breaking the back of Hitler's might, the vast majority of Jews knew and understood that his takedown of Red Skull had played a key part in stopping the madness. Red Skull would have continued Hitler's work, very probably on an even larger scale, had the captain not stopped him. And he had liberated at least one camp that Magneto had heard of, possibly more. Who his companion was, however, that was a mystery. It certainly wasn't anyone Magneto recognized from Charles' group of students, and the man was definitely old enough to have manifested as a mutant quite some time ago. If he was in fact a mutant, that was not a given. For all Magneto knew, the man was a descendant of one of the Howling Commandos. The door opened and the guard escorted the two men in. "Visiting hours are over at 5. Just wave if you want to leave before that," the guard said, then left. Which wasn't usually the way it went when Charles visited. Then again, as far as the guards knew, Charles was a completely normal, elderly paraplegic who would have little to no chance of defending himself if Magneto decided to engage in fisticuffs. It made sense for one of them to remain in the cell to safeguard Charles. Captain America, on the other hand, was definitely capable of defending himself in such an eventuality. He would, in point of fact, probably make a smear of Magneto if Magneto didn't resort to using his mutation.
"Gentlemen, to whom do I have the honor of speaking?"
Magneto asked.
"I am Stephen Grant Rogers, though you would probably know me better as Captain America."
Much to Magneto's secret delight, the man actually blushed, referring to himself by his title. That aside, the man had almost immediately settled into a square stance, arms folded across his chest, and a distinctly disapproving look in his eyes as he glowered at Magneto.
"And I am Loki,"
the dark-haired man said. His expression was, well, nearly blank. At most, there was a vague look of polite curiosity. At least until you got a good look at his eyes. That made Magneto blink, then cock his head. About 10,000 questions raced through his mind. But first things first.
"Captain, it is a very unexpected pleasure and honor. Do please be seated, both of you."
Magneto motioned to the 2 chairs at the table where he and Charles played chess. The chess set was currently tucked under his bed until their next match. Magneto himself settled for sitting on the side of his bed since there weren't 3 chairs in the cell.
I must confess myself to be incredibly curious on several subjects, Magneto said after both men had taken their seats, and finding it quite the quandary as to where to start. I was dug out of the ice about 8 months ago, the captain said, rightly divining one of the questions Magneto wanted to ask. Exactly how I survived is something no one's quite sure about, but the best guess is that I basically went into hibernation. And the legendary super soldier serum had done the rest. Fascinating. Magneto turned his attention to Loki. And didn't that name just beg about a dozen questions? A close, discerning look at the man's face made it clear that whether or not the man was the Loki of Norse legend, he definitely shared that being's purported intelligence and crafty nature. His eyes were wary, watchful, and calculating. This was a man you underestimated at your peril.